All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm not sure how many people are going to be here today. I understand that there's something like spring break coming up, and so sometimes people decide to start spring break early, like maybe a whole week early or 2 or 3 days early. So we'll go ahead and get started here today. Our topic for today is the rise of Islam. Last time I talked about monasticism on Tuesday and how that develops and how the church develops that way. So today, also included in our chapter is the rise of Islam. And of course, this has a major impact on the Western world. It certainly still does today. And so I want to take a look at the origins then of Islam. How did it get started? What are some of its basic beliefs? And then maybe how it expands. So let's go ahead and get started. When we think about the Islamic world or the religion of Islam, we normally think of Arab people, right? And that's to be expected because Islam begins with Arab people. But one thing we have to keep in mind, I always tell people, not all Muslims are Arabs, and not all Arabs are Muslims, okay? So we need to keep that in mind. But it does certainly begin there because, Muhammad was an Arab, and the first Muslims were all Arabs. And it will expand after that. So if we take a look at Arab people then, we need to remember as we're thinking about this is that the Arab people had a pre-Islamic history. Matter of fact, the Arab people were around a long time before Islam came. We know as early as the 5th century, Herodotus mentions Arabs in his writings, and he's writing in the 5th century BC. That's roughly 500 years before Christ. He mentions Arabs, and they weren't new then. Okay? And of course, Islam is not going to start until the 600s. So, we've got at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 years that we can trace back at least some Arab history prior to Islam. In fact, there was a substantial Arab kingdom. This Arab kingdom is called the Nabateans. The Nabateans actually will overlap with the Roman period. And if you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, that was out quite a while ago, but you might have seen that. Anybody here see that? Yeah, several. They've got a knight that's back in a cave. Indiana Jones goes back in that cave to try to find the chalice of Christ. Well, anyway, you can watch the movie sometime. But the cave, the entrance to the cave he goes in, was at this place in Jordan. It's called Petra. And Petra is one of the most famous sites in the Middle East, if not the world. It's a world-class, a World Heritage Site. And it was built by the Nabateans. The Nabateans were Arabs. And in fact, that building that they show, in fact, is not a building, it is a facade. It's carved into the bedrock, the sandstone that's down there. This is a building that's similar to it, or a structure similar to it, but much bigger. This is called El Dir. It's pictured here. So I've been to Petra many times, and this was the capital of the Nabateans. In fact, this summer, I am going, at least I'm intending to go, to England to give a paper on Nabateans in a temple, a Nabatean temple that we worked on as part of an archaeology project I was on. And that conference is in Oxford, England. And so that'll be in July. So I'm planning to be there, all right? That's after I go to Israel. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get all this stuff done that I've got planned for myself. I usually plan too much stuff. Anyway, there were plenty of non-Muslim Arab, a lot of history that we can look at. This Nabatean kingdom, by the way, dates back at least to 200 BC. and then goes until AD 106. That's very specific because that's when the Romans take over Arabia. And they make Arabia a province, Provincia Arabicus, the Arabian Peninsula. Now, we also, when we think of Arab people, very prominent in this are tribes of Arabs that are often called Bedouin, Bedouin. The Bedouin then are nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who live in the Middle East. They still live there today. And over the last, at least the last century or so, there's been very concerted efforts to try to settle these people down. That is, to make them sort of live in one place. Because what they were very accustomed to is move from place to place. That's what I mean by nomadic. And they're semi-nomadic because they would sort of move in the same pattern year after year. So they were sort of in the same location, but they're moving. Mainly they're moving because they raise sheep and goats, and they need to go where the food is and where the water is. In this part of the world, as you might remember earlier in the semester, we mentioned it doesn't rain, really, in the summer. And so this will change their patterns. It'll change where there are plants to eat and where there's water to drink. So there's a lot more rain in the winter than there is in the summer. And so that they'll move to where there are springs or water and where there's also food to be eaten. So the governments have been trying to settle them down. In fact, they'll build them a house. I've seen this more than once, where they've built them a house, and they sort of say, this is where you're living, and the people don't want to live inside the house. They just don't like it. So they'll set up their tent next to the house. They'll put the sheep in the house, concrete block house, as a sheepfold, like a cave, and then they live in the tent. Now, that's changing, but that's been a slow process, and for them it's cultural. They don't like, they like to feel the wind. They like to know, they like that kind of, and it's cooler, and many reasons more practical for them. Anyway, a lot more stories I could tell you about Bedouin, but the Bedouins will play into the story of the rise of Islam. One of the things that was in Bedouin culture, I guess we could say, is the idea of raiding. That is, these Bedouin often lived out in the countryside, and they moved from place to place. So that means they're not growing crops. They aren't going to be around to be able to settle down and grow crops because they're moving from place to place. So, what does that mean? There are people that are there who do move from place to place. They live in villages and towns. So often what would happen on occasion is that these Bedouin groups would invade or attack or raid, I'll call it a raid, because they're really not attempting to take over the city or town. They're really wanting certain things like grain, food, sometimes wives. Okay, I'll just be honest. Sometimes they're looking, it's hard to meet the ladies out in the desert. So, you come into town and there are ladies and there's food and there's other goods that they don't have. And so they would actually have this raid. So now, why do I tell you this? Because the raid gets incorporated, it's incorporated in Arab culture, but it also gets incorporated into Islam. So some of the things we have to keep in mind when we talk about Islam, some of the things we're talking about are Arab culture, that it becomes accepted by, let's say, Muslim people, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that's definitely taught in the Quran or something like that. Well, anyway, we'll get to that. So here we have the world of Islam early on. Now, here are the Bedouins. Here's a picture I took of some Bedouin boys with the camel. We often think of the camel, and we should, because the camel is the main beast of burden, I guess we'd call it, the main transportation. But the camel is, sometimes the Arabs have called the camel the ship of the desert, because you're sailing across the sand, and the camel is your ship. And they actually would use everything from the camel. In other words, they would milk. The camels have milk, by the way, they're mammals. They would take the milk of the camel and make it into a kind of cheese. Usually they dry it into round balls of dehydrated, desiccated cheese that they would then hydrate with water and sort of drink it maybe like you drink milk or yogurt or something like that, but it's a cheese-based. I've had it. It's not my favorite. It's an acquired taste, I think I would say. It's pretty pungent cheese, kind of salty, because they take all the water out. Then they kind of mix it with water and make a sort of yogurt. They have a yogurt drink and they have sort of a camel cheese drink. Anyway, so they use the camel also. They would eat it. I've eaten camel because the camel becomes it's actually very expensive. I mean, it's not something you would eat every day. It's something that's for special holidays. In fact, the way I ended up eating camel is that I would go on archaeology digs. I've been over many times to the Middle East, and you get to know the guys you're working with, and so they invite you to their house and things. And so there was one guy that I'd known for several summers, several years. And so when I saw him again, when we went back, I asked him how he was, and he told me his mother had died in the intervening time since I'd seen him. I told him I was sorry to hear that and so forth. And he said, well, in fact, they were getting ready because they have a big festival called the Festival of Eids, which is after the month of Ramadan. We're going to get to some of that. And they were actually going to kill a camel, butcher a camel, and then they were going to divide up the meat from the camel, and they were going to give it to the different families in the village. So that on this particular day, each family would receive, a piece of the camel to cook and eat. And the idea was everybody in the village, all these families would have some of this, and then it was kind of like a memorial. They would remember his mother as they had the meal because the family had provided the meat. Does that make sense? So so he told me that. I said, oh, that's interesting. And so I asked him, well, how, do you guys do this yourself? He goes, oh, yeah. So he actually brought me pictures, which I do not include here, of how they dispatched, as the British would say, the camel, which I didn't anticipate he would, but he did. And then he brought me a piece of the camel with him and gave it to me. So I felt obligated to eat the camel, since this was dedicated to his mother. All right, so that's how I came to eat some camel. It was sort of like a meatball, camel meatball with rice. It was okay. I don't think I was eating it under ideal conditions either. It was kind of cold, but anyway. Now, so the camel then, they use the skins, they use the meat, they use the milk, they use it for transportation, they make their tents out of it, they make other leather goods make leather goods out of it. The camel is very important to them, and still today, this idea of killing a camel and having it as sort of like we have turkey at Thanksgiving. Some of these people who are sort of descendant from the Bedouins have camel on their big festival day at the end of Ramadan. Okay, so that's why these camels are coming. That's why I bring it up. These camels are being brought from Saudi Arabia and brought up through Jordan to go to a market where they're going to be sold to prepare for the feast. People will come and buy a camel, and that's what they're going to use it for. All right? A lot more we can say about camels. I like camels, like I said before, but they don't like me much. So. Well, the other thing that we see is the tribal organization of the Arab people. This is going to be also transferred over into when we think about Islam today, is that part of what we're interacting with or thinking about is tribal organization. Okay, which in the United States, depends on where you are, we don't have much tribal organization here, right? Now, where I came from in eastern Kentucky, there was what I would call tribal organization. There were family groups, and they were sometimes related to each other, sometimes they didn't like each other, sometimes they had a feud, literal feud where they'd fight with one another. So there was kind of a tribal thing. So in eastern Kentucky where I lived, there was tribal. And here I haven't really, encountered that. But you certainly do in the Middle East. So there is a sheikh. The sheikh is the head of each tribal group. The sheikh has a council of elders. So one person, one man would be the sheikh of, say, this group. And then there would be maybe 8 or 10, depending on the size, of other sort of elders who, he would have a council, we would call it, and they would come together and discuss things and make decisions. But the sheikh's decision would be final. So you might think of the sheikh as being sort of like a mayor, a judge, All these descriptions would be correct. If there was a dispute between two people, it would probably, if they can't resolve it, it would end up taking it to the sheikh, and the sheikh would resolve it. And then his decision would be final. Okay, and this council usually might assist. Anyway, so you got to remember that setup too. Yes?
So like with like my country or franchise and everything. So it's like is it still going on, the shake thing? Because we don't
Sure.
have it anymore.
Oh no, they're still sheikhs, yeah. Yeah, definitely there. I knew a man who was a sheikh. I don't know if I guess he probably still is. I haven't seen him in a few years, but his father had been the sheikh. So I knew him through the Department of Antiquities, and yeah, he was a sheikh of a whole region. Big sheikh, big power, powerful guy. Yeah, that's still there. So I mean, that affects the politics. So for example, when you think about, let's say in Iraq, when the United States was there and they were fighting against Saddam Hussein, right? Saddam Hussein was from a certain family, tribe, clan, whatever you want to call it, and they were Sunni Muslims, whereas the majority of people in Iraq were Shia Muslims. And so the Sunni Muslims were controlling the Shia Muslims. And so if you do something to a person in that family, then they come after you. I mean, they will come after. I mean, it's not. For example, I'll give you one example. I don't want to run out of time, but I'll give you an example. This example is when I was on an archaeology excavation. We'd have people to work for us. So we would hire men usually to work for us, and then they would come to work. But sometimes if they got another chance at another job, they figured they already had our job sewed up, so they would send their son. Okay? So, you have Muhammad each day, and all of a sudden Muhammad's out there. Here's his son. Well, his son might be called. He might be Abu Muhammad, and he sends Muhammad, right? So Muhammad was working for me. We had a big stone. I mean, it was as long as that table just about, and wider, and about as high. So it was a big block of stone. And we were on a slope. And so we were coming in there to take a photograph of it because the whole thing was paved as part of a road. So the photographer came, and Muhammad was down there and said, well, let's sweep it up. So he's down there kind of sweeping, cleaning up the stones for the picture. Photographer leaned against that big stone. And it fell. And I yelled, and Muhammad backed up against, he was in a pit, backed up against it. It missed him, didn't hit him. But of course, I got a giant stone there. It was a very close call. So the next day, Abu Muhammad, the father of Muhammad, shows up. And he begins relaying to me that, he had heard about what almost happened to his son. And I said, oh, yes, well, I'm sorry about that, Evan. And so, he didn't really speak much English, and, I have some Arabic, but I wasn't quite picking it up, so I asked one of the other guys, what's he saying? He's saying that if the stone would have killed Muhammad, he would have killed you. I believe him. At least he would have tried. Probably would have happened. Okay? Because if something happens to his son or something happens to his family, it happens to him. That's the way they look at it. In the Arab world, family is primary. If you don't have family, then you're outside the sort of zone of protection and all the sort of normal things of society. So family is very key. So you have to keep that in mind when we talk about Islam as well. All right, so camels, like we said, are used for a lot of things, transportation. And of course, one of the things that's going to happen is trade. Trade's going to come from, well, India, China, a lot of items, and they're going to come across the desert on routes. So things like silk and different spices and things like that. Luxury items, things that are fairly lightweight, not huge bulky things, and which are expensive. Okay, we call those luxury items. So silk, perfume, spices, that's the kind of stuff. And maybe precious metals or rubies, gemstones, that kind of stuff. These are things that are worth a lot of money, but they don't take up a lot of space. You put those on camels, you have a caravan coming across the desert. And that becomes something that's really what built the Nabatean Empire, is that trade. And that becomes a backbone of the money in this part of the Arab world for centuries, is being a sort of what we call a middleman, at least what they used to call a middleman, somebody that's in between the source and where you sold it. So you're transporting it in between. All right, pre-Islamic Arabs, you have to remember, were polytheistic. That is, they worshiped many gods. Polytheistic, and these gods were represented by stones. Here's one. It's from the city of Petra. That's also where that first picture was from, Petra, Nabatean capital. This is a god called Dusaras. Dusaras sort of has a blockhead, right? It's a pillar, sort of a pillar. Well, you know, you read in the Bible about standing stones. Or you can, or you should, or it's there, right? It's there, right? You think about Baal, often represented by a standing stone. There are other standing stones that represent different gods. Pillars. Well, this is sort of a modification of that, this idea that this is the standing stone, Dusaras. You can see writing on the bottom down here. This is an early form of Arabic, Nabatean, down at the bottom. And they're represented by the stones. Now, there will be at Mecca, long before Islam, Mecca was a religious center. All right, that's one thing you need to keep in mind. Mecca, certainly today, we affiliated or associated with Islam, and we should, rightly so. But it was a religious center prior to Islam. There were many gods, goddesses represented at Mecca. It was, you know, had a shrine or, you know, a center, religious center, however you want to call it, at Mecca. And several standing stones, different stones were there that represented, and a lot of these were in particular to a different tribe. So one, you know, a tribal group would sort of have its own god. Now, one of these was called Allah. Allah was represented by a black stone that many people think was a meteorite. By the way, this black stone is still at Mecca. It's still at Mecca. It's in a central rectangular building called the Kaaba, and that's at the center of the mosque at Mecca. Okay? So, the idea here is that this was a religious center, and since Mecca was a trade center, Mecca was also the kind of place where people would come, and they were asked to set aside their differences, because a lot of these tribes had rivalries with one another, you know, kind of like gangs coming after each other. The idea was when you entered Mecca, you sort of leave that behind. You sort of put your disputes behind. You come into Mecca to worship and do trade, and then once you leave Mecca, you know, whatever you want to do after that's fine. But once you're there, it's kind of like a sanctuary, okay? A sanctuary from the violence or fighting in Mecca. So Mecca was a special city prior to Islam, and connected with religion and always connected with trade. All right, let's move on. Now, between 4 and 600 AD, trade is growing again. Remember, the Romans took over the territory in 106 AD, and they control it up into the 300s, up until the 4th century. And so there's a transition. As the Roman Empire gets weaker and loses control on its borders, this is when the Nabateans and the Arabs take back over the trade. And so things are really kind of booming for them between 4 to 600 AD. Trade is growing. Things are prospering. Of course, with that, with the new trade routes and all the money, you know, there's going to be disputes, conflicts over the trade routes. Who controls this trade route? And also the water supplies. There's just very few places in the desert you can get any water. So that was very much a flashpoint, right? If there happened to be an oasis in the desert or some other water source, these are carefully guarded and they try to be controlled. But all of this makes Mecca then, once again, very important because Mecca is now the center of this trade. And it's where they would come because it's near the coast. Mecca is near the coast of the Red Sea. So you can bring goods across the desert that are coming from, let's say, Oman, or what today would be the United Arab Emirates, you know, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And the things would come from India and China, and it would come that way. They come across the desert, all the way across to the Red Sea, or sometimes it'd be put in ships, or just go on up the coast to Petra, and then on up to the Mediterranean, or it could be sold in Syria, or what today would be Turkey, or on to, you know, the Byzantines or the Romans. All right, let's move on. Here is a map that shows us some of these things. Here's Mecca. You see Mecca? Right there, right on the coast. To the north of it is Medina, called Yatrib. Yatrib, early on. And then to the north of that, like up here where near the Sinai, near the eye, north of the eye is Petra. Petra is right in there. And you can see, take a look, for example, Egypt, Anatolia, Thrace. All this stuff is Christian territory controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire, or by this point, we could call it the Byzantine Empire. And then you have the Sasanian Empire over here, which are really Persians. It's a sort of a remnant of the Persian Empire. And then, of course, down here in the Arabian area, nobody really controls that. It's all controlled by local tribal things, because there wasn't much motivation to go down here and control it, to be quite honest. It's just a lot of desert. Even the Arabs call this area right there where it says Arabian Peninsula, this whole area out here, they call it the empty quarter, because there's really nothing. I mean, it's just sand and rocks. There's no settlements. There's no water. So this is about 600 AD. This is what it looks like. All right? Let's go on. Now, enter Muhammad. So we're finally there. Maybe I should have started saying how much time we got. Well, we're still okay. All right. Muhammad, 570 to 632, roughly, are his dates of his life. Muhammad, of course, doesn't begin as a Muslim, because Islam is not still around when Muhammad is born. He is born then around 570. He is born to a family that had been merchants. That's not surprising, because a lot of people were around the Mecca area. But one thing that is unusual for him is that he is orphaned at about the age of 6. This is going to be a significant thing in his life, and I think makes an impact on Islam. That's my interpretation. But the idea here is that if you are an orphan in the Arab world, you don't have the protection of your family, or at least your mother and father. He was sent off to live with an uncle, with a grandfather for a while, and then an uncle. And his uncle wanted to kind of toughen him up and send him out to live with the Bedouin. Go out and live with a Bedouin for a year or two, right? They'll teach you how to survive, teach you how to make it, hard work. And so Muhammad was keenly aware that orphans didn't have the same protection as other people. And so a lot of the things that you see in the Quran talk about orphans, and it talks about widows, and it talks about that sort of thing, okay? Because of that, I think. Well, that's my interpretation. So he then will eventually become a manager. He works at the caravan, becomes a manager of the caravan, and then Muhammad got money the old-fashioned way. He married it, okay? Some people say, how do you get rich? Well, the easiest way, the most old-fashioned way to get money is to marry someone who's wealthy. So keep that in mind. There's my dating advice. You're not going to hear probably anywhere else. A lot of married couples have trouble with money, finances. One way to avoid that, marry someone who's wealthy. And I'm not saying eliminate all your problems, but I grew up without much money, and so having money, I think, is easier than not having money. I don't care what your situation is. But anyway, do what you like. I know we've got the Hollywood view of romance. But, there's a lot of places in the world where marriages are arranged, and people seem to get along just fine. So, as my mother used to say, you can fall in love with somebody who's rich as easily as you can fall in love with somebody who is not rich. So, there you go. I did not marry someone who's wealthy, but anyway, there you go, for what it's worth. That's how Muhammad got his money, all right? He married the widow of his boss. So, think about that. That means now, he doesn't have to work. You know how bosses don't work much. Bosses wouldn't agree, but he has a lot more time on his hands now, because now, he is about 40 years old. He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of time on his hands. So what does he do? He starts thinking about stuff. People that are real busy don't have a lot of time to sit around thinking about stuff. All right? Especially, you got all your cell phones. You got nothing to think about. What's appearing on that screen and all that kind of stuff, right? You got to take your selfies. Take a lot of selfies. I need to get one of those sticks. A selfie. I don't have one. Maybe I need one. I could carry it around with me. I've seen people, like when I travel, there'll be people that just walk around with a selfie stick, like all the time. Just like, I don't know, like they're videoing the whole thing. It's like, hi, here I am. And they're just walking around like, they got their own, like they're their own personal camera. Man or person, woman, or whatever. Anyway. So it is spring break. It's time to break out the selfie stick and video. You can video your entire spring break and upload it. You can live stream it to Facebook. I get these things. I'm on what I call the Facebook, and I'll get like these little red dots that say, "Oh, something important is happening," and I'll click on it, and it'll say, "This person is live streaming." I never watch it. I don't want to know. I don't want to hear it. What is it? I watched one of them once, and it was like some guy that I know him, but he's like just like sitting in his room ranting about stuff. I don't want to hear that. Anyway, maybe that's what you want. But I've never done that, but you could do that. It is spring break, so you know what that means. It's time for you to load all your dirty laundry up that you've had since Christmas, that you probably haven't really washed much since Christmas. You load it all up, and now you carry it to your mother, and you give your mother a spring break present. A giant garbage bags full of your dirty clothes. And you say, "Hi, Mom, great to see you. I'm going into the couch and watching, eating pizza or something, watching Netflix. We'll see you later. Hope you get all that laundry done before I have to go back." You're not going to do that, right? No? Yeah, it's not everybody's saying no. Okay. That's all right. You don't have to confess. Confession's good for the soul, but you don't have to confess that right now. Well, anyway, Muhammad's got time on his hands. That's too, you guys distracted me. That's what I was talking about. He goes up into the mountains nearby Mecca, and he begins to meditate. Meditate about things, religion, about, purpose of life. I know all that kind of stuff. You got a question? Yeah, go ahead.
The Mecca here, just for clarification. Is this the Mecca of Saudi Arabia?
It is.
I didn't realize it was close to Yemen, actually.
It is. It's pretty close. Yeah. It's near the coast, and it's not that far from Yemen, It's a lot closer than we are to Yemen. That's why some people say, "Is it that close?" Well, it's a lot closer than we are right now. But yes, it's not far. It's not far from Yemen. Well, anyway, he begins to, at least he says, he receives messages from God. Actually, the angel, Gabriel, you've heard of Gabriel, visits him, he says, and he receives messages. Because, he says, "Well, Muhammad, you have a lot of questions. God wants to tell you here, he has chosen you to be a prophet. Like there were prophets in the Old Testament, prophets to the Jews, prophets to the Christians. You'll be a prophet now. You'll actually be the final prophet." And the basic teaching would be is that the Arab people need to get rid of this polytheism, get rid of all these gods, and worship just one God, the one true God, Allah. Okay, so he begins to preach then against polytheism in and around Mecca, because that's where he lives. It didn't go that well. Not that many people accepted what he had to say. Now, some people wonder, if you read the Quran, or even look through it, you're going to see a lot of things that will look familiar to you. A lot of names, a lot of places, even a lot of stories that are very similar to what you might read in the Old Testament or New Testament. Where'd that come from? Well, a Muslim would tell you it comes from God, because Muhammad received it from God, and the reason that it's the same is because the God of Islam is the same as the God of the Jews and the God of the Christians, and so he's conveying the same story. The source is the same, God. Now, if you don't accept that, where did it come from? Well, Muhammad did have a lot of contact with Christians and Jews as he was trading. In fact, he had a great respect for Jews, Christians, believe it or not, he did, and he really wanted the Jews to accept him as a prophet. In fact, you may not know this, and I don't usually tell this because we don't have enough time, but I guess I'm wandering today, so I'll tell you that in the beginning of Islam, the very first place that they prayed towards Jerusalem. That was the first city they prayed towards. And it wasn't until Mecca had converted, which is going to come later, they begin to pray that way. Okay? Anyway, so he probably got some of these ideas, and that might be where he got it, depending on how you interpret these events. Certainly he had contact. Now, one of the things that a Muslim will be very adamant about is that Muhammad was illiterate. You might find that strange. Why would he be so adamant that their main prophet, their main leader, couldn't read or write? Because they want to say that basically Muhammad did not perform miracles like Jesus did. And they admit Jesus did. But they say really the miracle that Muhammad performed was to recite the Quran, having never been able to read or write. So what they're trying to say is that means it really came from God. He didn't read the Bible. He didn't read the Old Testament. God just gave it to him and he spoke it in this very sort of ornate Arabic, right? Not sort of common Arabic. So, nonetheless, however you interpret it, if you look at the Quran, it has many things in it you'll find in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So here's a copy of the Quran. There's all different kinds of copies of the Quran. I've seen a Quran written on an ostrich egg. Somebody started at the top, wrote in a circle, wrote the whole thing down to the bottom. Very tiny, tiny letters, of course. Sometimes they're very ornate looking books. Sometimes this one's a pretty simple looking book. But in this book, it mentions Jews and Christians, and he calls them people of the book. They're called people of the book. Kitab. Kitab means book. What does that mean? That means that the Jews received revelation from God. They had prophets. The Christians had prophets. Therefore, on the one sense, Jews and Christians are special because they had received messages. They had their own prophets from God, as the Arab prophet was Muhammad. But on the other hand, the more that you know, the more responsibility you have, right? You say, oh, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that. Well, now you do. Now, if you do it now, you knew you weren't supposed to do it. And so the idea here is that, yes, Christians and Jews are special because God revealed things to them. But on the flip side of that is that they're actually more responsible than, say, a pagan, like, say, a Hindu, who didn't have this revelation. So it's sort of goes both ways. Now, the word Islam and the word Muslim come from the same root. Take a look at it. You've got an S, an L, and an M. Because remember, in Semitic languages, you only really look at the consonants. The vowels are added in. You pronounce them, but they're not written. Does that make sense? So, the same root of both words is SLM, and that word means submit or submission. So, Islam means submission. And a Muslim means one who is submitting. One who is in the process of submitting. It's an ongoing action. All right, so that's basically what it means. You submit to God's will. So if you decide to become a Muslim, basically you just say, I'm going to submit to God, and you'll be in that process of submitting to God for the rest of your life. So it'll never really be done. It'll always be in the process of submission. So it's really about submission. Now, Islam is going to begin to expand. Muhammad preaches in Mecca for about 3 years. And he only had about 35 followers, right? He didn't have a lot of followers after 3 years. And most of them were his relatives, right? His uncle, his wife, stuff like that. And so he didn't have a lot of success there. Yeah. Sure.
And then like the God, the Allah, and then the God of the Muslims. But Allah actually you say originated from the God before?
Well, there was the black stone that is in Mecca, was there before. Yeah. It was there prior to Islam. The idea here is that is a representation or a remembrance of the true God, but that the other ones were false gods. Yes. And so what's going to happen is, I'll finish this and I'll come right back to it. is that he leaves Mecca in 622, our year AD 622. That sets the Islamic calendar, their year 1. This is called the Hijrah, or the journey. He leaves, he journeys away from Mecca, and he goes to Medina. And when he gets to Medina, which is called Yathrib, it takes the name Medina because Medina in Arabic means city. And so city of the prophet is what it comes to be called. So its name changes from Yathrib to Medina. At any rate, he gets a lot more followers there, including local Bedouins. And then they will turn around about 8 years later, and they will go in force back to Mecca and take the city over by force in 630 AD. When they enter the city, they take the city, and one of the first things they do is they go to this central area where all these idols are, all these stones, and they destroy them all, except for the true one that was connected with Abraham. So it was connected with Abraham, and that is the black stone. Okay? So they cleanse, you might say, they cleanse the shrine at Mecca from all the false gods, and they leave this representation of Allah, the true God, and they say Allah. In fact, if you talk to a Muslim, let's say, if you talk to an Arab who's a Christian, and you ask them, well, when you pray and you say the name God, what do you say? You say Allah, because Allah is the word for God in Arabic. So Christians use it, Muslims use it. Okay? Well, anyway, so here then is the expansion. Look at the expansion. It starts down here at Mecca, okay? Now, Yemen is really down here, so, it is close to Yemen, and over here's Oman, and here's Yemen. So, it starts in Mecca, and then he moves to Medina, or Yathrib, okay, just to the north along the coast. And then, of course, he turns back around about 8 years later, and he takes Mecca. So that area that's in that, whatever color you want to call it, kind of a tan, a brown, I don't know, whatever you call that color, that color there along the coast is where Islam first begins, okay? And a lot of that's desert, by the way, so mostly along the coast. But take a look at what happens. Within 100 years after the death of Muhammad, Islam is spread all the way across. Within 30 years, he dies in 632 to 661, all this purple, I'm going to call that purple. Well, I don't know what you call it, but I'm calling it purple. All that purple color here, Persia, Egypt, across part of North Africa, all of that is converted to Islam in about roughly 30 years, very rapidly. And then after that, this sort of, sand color, lighter tan color, or Spain, North Africa, and then way out here, out in this area. On the screen here, it looks a little bit brighter than it does on my screen, more of an orange. Anyway, all of that gets converted, let's say, by roughly 750. So within about 100 years, Islam has spread from just along the coastline of Saudi Arabia to going all the way up to France, all the way out to Pakistan, and all the way up to the Caspian Sea, and all the way across North Africa. That's huge expansion in about 100 years. If you talk to a Muslim, how did that happen? You know what they say? Allah. It's God's will. That's why it happened. But it happens by expansion, using military force, and that sort of thing. Okay, here's what you were just talking about. Here's where the black stone is located. This is called the Kaaba. The Kaaba, then, when he enters Mecca, he goes to that and he declares that a true shrine, connected with Abraham, connected with the covenant of God. And so everything else is cleaned out. And so still inside of that black rectangular cubical building is the black stone. The black stone is in one of the corners. I think it's this corner here. And so they will actually pull. That outside of it is actually kind of cloth. It's sort of like velvet or something. They pull it back, and then people can see it. They pull it up, and people actually go and touch it. Okay? But if you look at this picture, all those little dots are people. In all of Islam, everyone prays in a straight line. If you go to a mosque, okay, when you enter the mosque, people will face, if the mosque has been built just to be a mosque, one of the walls is going to be, as you look forward, you're going to be facing Mecca. There'll be a marker. I'll show you in a minute. There'll be a marker in the wall, let you know which way is Mecca. And then you line up in straight lines and you pray, and we'll talk about that. You pray simultaneously. It's a ritualistic prayer. But here at Mecca, you pray in a circle. Because actually you're facing Mecca when you pray, but you're actually facing that black stone. The black stone's in Mecca. So when you get there, the black stone's in this cube, so they actually circle around it. All right. All the other stones are called idols, and they are destroyed and it's cleared out. And so now the religious nature of Mecca is preserved, but it of course it's transformed. Yes.
So they're actually bowing down to the stone, right?
You could say that.
Is it still in there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would say they're bowing down to God, but yes, they're bowing down towards Mecca at every mosque. And in Mecca, they circle this, and yes, they do their direction of prayers this way. Okay? All right, Islam then. Now, it's a monotheistic religion. That's the main thing to remember. Worship only one God. By the way, if you talk to a Muslim, and, as I have many times, they want to know, of course, if you're a Muslim, and I say no, and I say I'm a Christian. And say, you're a Christian? I say yes. They said, so do you believe in God? I say, yes, I believe in God. And then they said, okay. Do you believe in one God? I said, yes, I believe in one God. They said, do you believe that Jesus is God? I said, yes, I believe Jesus is God. They said, well, then you believe in two gods. You believe in God in heaven, and you believe in Jesus as God. That's two gods. Now, I don't at that point bring up the Holy Spirit. But they'd say, I believe in three gods, right? So I try to explain to them the Trinity. That's kind of hard to do. Okay? It's a little difficult. So you try to say, well, no, I really believe in one God, but, there's three in one. Yeah, they don't get that part. They just say, well, you believe in two gods, you believe in three gods. You're not a monotheist, is what they're really saying. Now, besides the monotheistic connection between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, there's also the connections between Judaism and Christianity in many of the stories, many of the, sort of the history of it. The Muslim would compare themselves all the way back and trace themselves all the way back to Abraham, whom they call Ibrahim, but it's the same guy, just the way you pronounce his name. And a lot of people's names actually come right out of the Bible. I've met a lot of guys named Ibrahim. Musa, which is Moses, for example. Daoud, which is David. And my name, John, you know what my name is in Arabic? Sometimes I tell them, they ask my name, I tell them my name. I tell them, Yahya. Yahya is the name of John. There was a prophet. Here we're talking about John the Baptist. It's considered to be a prophet within Islam. And his head was cut off, They have that same story. And so I tell them sometimes, my name is Yahya. What? Yahya. So that really gets them. And Abraham's lineage then, if you take a look at it, we say normally the bloodline, in these patriarchal families, goes through the eldest. Who is the eldest son of Abraham? It's not Isaac, it's Ishmael. So they trace themselves back to Ishmael and his mother Hagar. And how she, was, in the biblical story, she was driven away. But of course, in their story, he was not driven away. At any rate, then they go and they recognize the Old Testament, most of the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament prophets, they recognize. So, for example, like I said, Adam, they recognize as a prophet. Abraham is a prophet. David is a prophet. Solomon, I call him Suleiman. I've met guys named Suleiman. And so forth. And then right on up, they have the story of a guy with a big fish, Jonah. They recognize Jonah as a prophet. Right on up to John the Baptist. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, is a prophet. I've met guys named Zachariah, who's a Arab name, and then Jesus. Jesus is considered to be a prophet, but not divine. Okay? And Jesus' birth is considered to be a special birth. And Jesus' mother, Mary, or Miriam as they call it, is mentioned a lot in the Quran. Really. I think it's surprising people's never read it when you start to read and they talk about the special birth that Jesus had and a lot of things like that. Okay? All right, let's move on. We got more things. So the key difference then is that, of course, Jesus is not divine, he's a prophet. And then, of course, also that Muhammad is a prophet. Muhammad is special as a prophet because he's the last one. God sent prophets, they would say, to the Jews. He sent prophets to the Christians. And those people rejected and altered the messages of the prophets. They didn't stick with it. That's their interpretation. So since they didn't stick with it, God's sort of given humans one last chance, one more prophet. That's Muhammad, and that's going to be it. This is it. There will be no more prophets. So Muhammad is the final prophet. What Muhammad recited, because he didn't write it, he recited it, is the Quran. In fact, the word Quran means to recite or recitation. The Quran is what was recited by Muhammad. And it's divided into 114 surahs, or, we could call them books, but really they're more like chapters, I guess. But anyway, there are various lengths. The Quran is about the length of the New Testament, okay, just for a sort of a guide. It's not as long as the whole Bible, but the New Testament. Now, in addition to the Quran, if you really wanted to understand what Muslims believe and so forth, and how they're going to live, there is something called Sharia, which you might have heard about on the news. They often talk about Sharia law. Sharia law. Now, what I think gets lost anyway in the discussion about Sharia law is that Sharia law is not just a long list of laws that then are applied. Sharia law is actually, there are different interpretations of the law that become Sharia. Sharia then is the application of the principles, the laws that would come out of the Quran, but also out of the Hadith. See, Hadith. What is the Hadith? The Hadith are the sayings of Muhammad. Now, remember Jesus lived 33 years, roughly, most people say, and that his ministry lasted about 3 years, right? Most people agree. So roughly from the age of 30 to 33, Jesus, and we have in the New Testament and the Gospels a record of a lot of things that Jesus said. But even if you take a look at the Gospel of John, well, how does John end his Gospel? He says, many other things Jesus did and said that are not recorded here. If they were, it would take up, many books, right? So imagine that Jesus had lived, his ministry had been longer than 3 years. Let's say his ministry had been 30 years. How many things could be written? Muhammad lived quite a while after he began Islam. And so what we see then is that there are many things written down, not that Muhammad wrote, but that Muhammad said. Somebody would come to Muhammad and ask for an interpretation, and Muhammad would give them an interpretation, and then that would be recorded, and that's later written down. That's the Hadith. It's not the Quran. It's not reciting from God. It's Muhammad's interpretation of how you do things. And when you try to look and see some of the things that are associated with Islam, you're not going to find them in the Quran, like chapter and verse. You're supposed to pray, but the idea of praying 5 times a day actually comes from the Hadith. Yes?
So is the Hadith also considered divine then?
It's not the same as the Quran, no. But he is the final prophet, so it's not equal. Technically, if you ask him, it is not equal with the Quran. But in practice, if you say you're going to do something that goes against the Hadith. Now, there are whole panels of people that actually make judgments of whether what the person reported was there. In fact, they have sort of like day by day where Muhammad was. They've actually recreated his life, up to his death. And so if somebody came at some point and said, well, yeah, I met Muhammad, then they would kind of interrogate, okay, you met Muhammad, when was that? Well, they would say the year. And, well, where were you? Well, I was in Damascus or something. Well, they say, well, you didn't meet Muhammad. Muhammad was not in Damascus ever, or certainly not that year. So where did you meet him? What did you say? And then if it's sort of many people testifying to it, it would get included. If it wasn't, then it would be evaluated and see if it's consistent with other things. So It's not as though anybody said Muhammad said this and they put it in there. There is a whole system of how something enters the hadith. Yes.
It's kind of like that. I know Judaism kind of have that too for the Torah.
Yes, it is. It is. I tell people it is very much like when the rabbis would get together and they would have the Mishnah, which is sort of a commentary on the Old Testament. It is a lot like that. It is like that. So is the Mishnah the same as the Bible? No, but if you're going to go against it, then you're saying a lot. Anyway, let's go through these 5 pillars. We've got to get through the 5 pillars. Now, I didn't make this up. This is what Muslims call this, the 5 pillars. And usually in this order. All right? Number 1, we've already said it, monotheism. So if you think of Islam as being, a building, then these would be the 5 pillars that hold up the building of Islam. The number 1 thing is monotheism. In fact, it gets summarized in this saying, the Shahada, which is, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. It is said, let's say somebody says that I want to become a Muslim. They would say, okay, say this, the thing I just said, and if you truly mean it, you're a Muslim. That's how you become a Muslim. If you say, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, and you really mean that, then you're now a Muslim. And so what that means is everything else that you will end up believing and doing and so forth is going to follow that. Because if you truly believe that there is only one God and it's Allah, and if you truly believe that Muhammad is his prophet, then you're going to have to submit yourself, to the Quran and to what was revealed, what was recited, and so forth. And there'll be lots of other things to add to it. Okay? So that's the number 1 thing. Number 2, prayers. Prayer is the backbone of Islam. Prayer is ritualistic. In fact, here is that's the Kaaba again. You see how they've lifted up the cloth? So that when people go around it, these are all people here. All people going around it. You can see how big this building is. And every year, there will be hundreds of thousands of people who go visit in just a window of time. But they'll come other times too. But prayer 5 times a day. Again, you're not going to find a chapter and verse in the Quran says 5 times a day. Obviously, prayer is in there. But there's also the practice. Muhammad led the Muslims for many years after he began it. And so the practices of how they did their prayers and how often they did their prayers and what time. What time? Well, it changes every day. I can't tell you you're going to pray here, 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 and here because it has to do with the rising and the setting of the sun. And that changes every day. Okay, that changes every day. But roughly, you're going to pray before the sun comes up. Let's say an hour or so before the sun comes up. Then you're going to pray in mid-morning. Okay, so let's say in the summertime you'd get up and pray around 5 a.m. something like that. Then you would pray at about 9 in the morning, something like that, roughly. And then you would pray at noon. And then you would pray in the late afternoon, let's say 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And then you would pray again just after the sun goes down. So you pray before the sun comes up, you pray after the sun goes down, you pray at noon, and then you got prayers sort of halfway in between that. Okay? Again, that's rough. And if you want to know, you can look it all up today. They have apps for your phone. You can go on websites. You put in your zip code. They will tell you the prayer times for today. There's one site called the Virtual Muezzin. You can Google it. Virtual Muezzin will give you the prayer times and also help you figure out the direction. And it also has a list of the closest mosque to your zip code. Yes?
I have a question. Could you say that 5 times a day, but in my country, you don't do 5 times a day?
Yeah.
Like the notes with the calling out.
Yeah,
Like 3 times a day. I wonder if the 5 times, like, you have to do it or like you do it?
Well, you're supposed to do it. Now, a lot of the call to prayer, you're going to hear the call to prayer from the Muezzin. It depends. I guess it depends on where you are. What country are you talking about?
From Madagascar.
Madagascar. Okay. Well, I don't. when I've been, now, maybe you just sleep through it, but, when I've been in Jordan, for example, at like 4:30 in the morning, they're calling, and in the evening, they call it 5 times a day. And the people are supposed to pray 5. Now, does everybody do it? No. And do you have to go to the mosque to do it? No. You can pray anywhere. You don't have to pray in a mosque. I've seen guys praying in their stores. I've seen guys praying on airplanes. I've seen guys praying alongside of the road, out in the middle of the country. I've seen them praying in fields. You can pray anywhere. But you're supposed to face Mecca, and you're supposed to pray at the right times. And it's a ritualistic prayer. So you would start in a standing position. And then you would eventually sort of bow. You would fold your arms. You would go to a kneeling position, and then you would bend your head all the way down, touch your forehead to the ground. So when you go into a mosque, you're supposed to take your shoes off because they don't want you tracking in all the stuff because they're going to be praying there. And usually there are rugs. And if you're not in a mosque, you have a prayer rug. And you would roll out your prayer rug and pray. You're also supposed to cleanse yourself before you pray. You're supposed to wash yourself. We won't go through all that, but you're supposed to do that each time. Okay? I've been in mosques where they actually, the mosque is so crowded, they put strings across from one side of the mosque to line people up in prayer so they get more people in there. Because, it's just a big open room. There are no chairs. And so, people just stand willy-nilly looking towards the front. But they put these lines there, and a lot of times the carpet will kind of have lines. Or they'll actually just take a string, just put a string right along the floor. Like from here, it would be every 3 to 4 feet, there would be a string, and then you'd line up on that. And then we'd all face, let's say, this way and pray. And you would do that and bow, come back down, come back up. And you do that, and you'd go through that 2 or 3 times, and everybody's saying the same thing. They're all doing it in unison. So that's the prayer time. All right, that's the second pillar. What's the third pillar? Zakat. Zakat is giving gifts to the poor. Sometimes called alms to the poor. You are to give 2.5% to the poor. Okay? So you don't give this to a lot. It's not like, say, in church where they pass an offering. I don't know how they do it in your church, but maybe they pass a plate. Right? A lot of churches pass a plate, or they'll have a box in the back. Or some of them really want to make sure you don't take anything out. They have a really long stick with like a little bag on it. And they kind of put that in front of you. You put the stuff in there, and they just keep moving it. So you don't get to hang on to it, see. I've seen guys do it. Guy wants to, I want to put something in, but all I got's a 20. I'm not putting a 20 in. So, here's a 20, and then you take out, like 18, and put it in your pocket, and then pass it on. Never saw that? Well, I have seen it. I've also seen where people pass KFC buckets. That's where you really want to save money. You get those buckets that the chicken comes in, you just pass those for the offering. Come on, fill it up. A lot of times when I lead those services, what I tell people to do, I tell the people to stand. I say, I want you to reach up in the pockets in front of you. I want you to withdraw their wallets, and I want you to give like you've always wanted to give. That's what I usually tell people. Well, I got to keep moving. I got too many stories. Here we go. Here's Ramadan. So alms support. By the way, I do want to say something about that 2.5%. In Christianity, of course, what do we usually? 10%, right? We call it the tithe. Now, tithe of what? 10% of what? Of your income. So, like you guys, earning, $400,000 or $500,000 a year, then you take 10% of that, and you're supposed to give that. And usually we give it to the church, right? You give the offering to the church or maybe some other organization, and that's what you do. That's not the way they do it in Islam. First of all, they take up no offering in a mosque. There's no sticks, there's no buckets, there's no Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets, nothing like that. No offering there. If something needs to be done, then usually someone says, okay, I will pay to put the roof on the mosque or repair this or whatever, or to build something. But with this, you give this straight to the poor people, directly. It's your responsibility. You don't give it to the church, a mosque secretary or treasurer, and then they write a check to somebody. You do it yourself. And by the way, the 2.5% is not of your income. It's 2.5% of your everything you own. So let's say, like you guys, you got your Lexus out there, and the Lexus is worth $50,000. Let's just say, it's a plain one. So it's maybe just $50,000. You got a house and it's worth, like $1 million or whatever, $250,000, whatever it's called. And so, and then maybe you got a business and your business is worth, several million. And you've got whatever thing you have, you add up what you have, how much it is, and you take 2.5%. And you do that every year. So that can start to add up to a lot. If you've got a lot of money, that can add up to a lot more than 10% of your income. Now, if you're somebody like me, it wouldn't, because you don't have much, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, for the wealthy, it does. All right. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
But isn't it like originally the time? Isn't it like everything you have though? Isn't that what Abraham did?
Well, most preaching that I've heard. Well, sure, you can give all you want to give. I mean, we're very happy. That's why I tell people. That's why we're passing the chicken bucket, so there's plenty of room to put all that money in there. But typically, what people say is a goal, they're not saying but sort of an initial goal is 10% of your income. Now, that's why some people make a distinction between a tithe and an offering. If we want to get real specific, they say, well, that's just the tithe, and then now this is your offering. So some people wouldn't call it an offering until you get past 10%. I don't want to get in all those debates. But yes, you can give as much as you want to give. Trust me, we will accept it. Here at Southeastern, we do take gifts. Anyway, and offerings, and tithes, and loans, and whatever else you want to give us. All right. I'm sure. Yeah, well, student loans. Student loans, we take that money too. Ramadan. Let's talk about Ramadan. Ramadan is actually the name of a month. It's the 9th lunar month. It's something I didn't talk about. In Islam, they have a lunar calendar. So that means that their calendar doesn't match up with our calendar. So what does that mean? That means that their months rotate through our months. So that means that Ramadan is, if you ask, sometimes people ask me, well, when is Ramadan? Ramadan is the 9th lunar month. Yeah, but when is Ramadan? I'll say it's the 9th lunar month. Well, when is Ramadan? Ramadan changes. The calendar, the lunar calendar, solar calendar, I think it's there's about 6 to 7 days a year that it changes. So it rotates through. So it takes about 28 years, I think it is, for the lunar calendar to cycle all the way through. So if Ramadan, is in June 15th, it'll go 28 days. Before it's going to be back to June 15th again, it's going to be 28 years, roughly. Okay? But what that also means is since you're supposed to fast and not eat or drink during daylight, that if you are hitting Ramadan in June, it's a lot tougher than if you're hitting Ramadan in December. And if you're hitting Ramadan in Scandinavia, it's different than if you're hitting Ramadan in Arabia. Well, anyway. So if you're hitting Ramadan in June in Scandinavia, they've actually had to pass some, they've had some intervention and say, yes, you can, because the sun never goes down. You see, so it means you would never eat. 28 days you never eat or drink, you're probably not going to make it. So they've actually passed and they've had some rulings, because now that Islam has spread all the way up that far, they've had to do that. And what you're supposed to do then is to save what money you save, and when you have the hunger and all that, you're supposed to think about the poor. All right. The 5th pillar, the Hajj. The Hajj is the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage. So Ramadan's fasting, Zakat is offering, Hajj is pilgrimage. You're supposed to go to Mecca at least once in your lifetime, which for most people, they don't have a lot of money. They're probably going to have to save their whole life to go. Now, it doesn't mean if you can't make it to Mecca that you are going to go to that terrible place of burning. It doesn't mean you won't go to paradise, but it just means it should be a goal, and you should save up for it. And so a lot of people save their whole life, and so they tend to go towards the end of their life. 60s, 70s, 80s, they'll go. You have to be in enough able to move and walk around a lot, but of course you got to have enough money. So a lot of people do it. So in fact, when somebody goes, they sometimes get the nickname, they call them Hajj or Haji. Hajj means, if you call somebody Hajj or Hajia, Hajj is a man, usually just a term of respect for an older man. And Hajia would be an older woman, because the assumption is they've been to Mecca, and so they've been around a long time. But of course, you're wealthy. You could go to Mecca every year. Nobody's going to stop you. And you could go, when you're quite young. But I'm just telling you, this is what most people do. Other rules of Islam. We still got a few minutes, so let's see if we can cover them. I got a few more screens. There are very strict rules. I'll try not to tell any stories, which I could, but I won't. Just so we get through it. Because we got spring break. Strict rules, dietary laws that are not unlike Jewish laws, kosher laws, although they're not exactly the same. Okay? But eating of pork is prohibited. No bacon for the Muslim, at least not a good Muslim, not supposed to eat any pork. Also, things like shellfish and stuff like that, and some similar laws they're not supposed to eat, just like in Jewish dietary laws. Certain animals you're not supposed to eat. Biggest one, of course, would be the pig, because people love bacon, right? Well, most people love bacon. Anyway, so a lot of dietary laws. Also, laws prohibiting the drinking of alcohol. Alcohol is prohibited. In fact, all intoxicants. The law has been expanded to all, so like other sorts of drugs that people might do are also prohibited. But alcohol, a Muslim is not supposed to drink any alcohol. In fact, in the Middle East, if somebody, like you go to Israel or Palestine, Jordan, if somebody is selling alcohol, then you know that's a Christian store. That's what they call it. That's a Christian store. Christian owns that store because he's selling alcohol. And you probably go in there and buy some bacon too. So it's a very decadent place. So and then the strict moral codes between men and women. No contact, no dating, and normally education is separated. Girls' school, boys' school, at least until you get to say college age. It's separated in the Middle East, most places. And so there isn't this idea of dating. So you can see where there could be a cultural clash from the West to the Middle East. Because a lot of the young people are watching the movies, hearing all the songs, and all that kind of thing. Polygamy is also allowed. You can have up to 4 wives. Only. I said I put only, didn't I? Yeah, only 4 wives. Can't have 5. Sorry. 6. Only 4. And in practice, though, really a lot of people I've met do not, because it's very, very expensive to have a wife. And if you got 4 of them, it's 4 times as expensive because you're supposed to treat all of them the same. For a lot of them, they actually have 4 houses, 1 for each wife. Right? Yes, because they fight. Well, anyway, Muhammad dies at 632, and then we see that there is a battle over who would succeed him. It's very patriarchal, as you probably picked up, very man-oriented. And Muhammad does not have a son. He has a daughter. If he would have had a son, then it probably would have solved it. But he had a daughter named Fatima. Fatima marries, within Islam, within Arab culture, marrying someone who's a cousin is not looked down upon. In fact, it's encouraged because it keeps the money and all the stuff in the family. And so she ends up marrying a guy who's actually like a cousin of Muhammad. So the idea then is it would maybe go through them, right? Go through the children then, because she had sons. She had 2 sons. So part of it, Abu Bakr is Muhammad's father-in-law, who had kind of taken over when Muhammad had gotten ill, and so he succeeds him. But then after that, there is a lot of debate as to who should do it. And remember, Muhammad had used the raid or the razzia against his enemies, and that's going to happen, and that's how Islam expands. They're actually going to use military force to expand to that map that I showed you earlier. Okay? That's succession. I've got another one here, succession, when you're ready for it. We still have a minute or 2, so we're all right. I've got 2 more slides, so we'll see if we make it. I might just stand here and finish recording it so I don't have to do it somewhere else, even if you leave. So here we go. I'm going to move on. This is just a map, so that's easy. Here again you see the lighter sort of tan around Mecca and Medina, and then you see a little bit darker area. That's where they expand, and then even the darker sort of greenish stuff. This is how much it expands in 100 years from the death of Muhammad, 632 to 733. Huge expansion. So this Islamic expansion then will continue. One of the terms that is often used is jihad. jihad means the striving in the way of the Lord. It actually means struggle. And so we often hear it in, it's like a war against someone in a jihad, which I suppose is true. But there's also the idea that jihad is internal, that you have a personal jihad with yourself to try to submit to God's will. Okay, it's a struggle to submit. Islamic powers will spread as far as the Yarmouk River, and that's the river that today divides Jordan and Syria. In 636, the Muslim forces defeat the Byzantine forces, and then they will eventually, very quickly there, take Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. They do not force people to convert to Islam, but through social pressure and high taxes and things like that, many people are encouraged to convert to Islam. In fact, the way that they took them here at the Battle of Yarmouk is that the river has a deep, deep gorge, kind of like the Grand Canyon. The Islamic forces set up with their back to the gorge, and then they sort of headed out towards the the Byzantine forces. When the Byzantine forces then come to engage, when they see them, then basically the Muslim forces turn and begin to run towards the gorge. And then when they get to the edge of the gorge, they turn and go each direction. The Christian forces had so much momentum and there's so much dust and everything that lots of them fell right over into the gorge, and they couldn't stop the momentum of it. Well, I hope you guys have a great spring break, and be safe.